Now it's time to move on to our next guests on this virtual stage. Stage 2, that's where you're at. Let me grab my notes here. So next up are the head of service design and the head of innovation and strategy and design at Frog. You're going to hear about why service design is ubiquitous while yet grossly misunderstood, and why our practices need to evolve and grow in order to maintain relevant. I want to welcome on stage Valeria Adani and Payal Wadhwa. Welcome. I'm really looking forward to your presentation, and the floor is all yours.
Hi, thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. As we begin to bring things up on screen, I mean, we've been looking forward to this talk for a very long time. It's it's been so long for us to be for us to come together as a community. It's something that we've wanted to do for the last year and a half. I hope everyone's been well through what the last year and a half or 2 years has brought us. But I'm so glad we can have these conversations, and we can begin to bring to you some of the conversations we've been having in our mix for the last year or so. We've been talking about how we learn from echoes, and today I'm here with Valeria, and we'll tell you a little about what's going on in our world at Frog, and effectively some of the things we'd love to pick your brains on. As we begin to move through the slide deck, and Valeria, I just want to make sure that the slides are moving, and now that we have said hello, we'll sort of move on. It's been an introspection at our end to really begin to think about what do conferences like this allow us to do? What do forums like this allow us to bring to the table? And where do creative practices really go as we begin to evolve into a world where innovation, strategy, and design become ubiquitous plays across business? And we really begin to think about the kinds of problems we look to solve as we move along. I often look at the practice that I have spent far too much time indulging in, which is architecture and the built environment practice. And the quote that you saw on the last slide around the moral depravity of the kinds of projects people do, the kinds of values people hold, can sometimes be in conflict. And it's something that I picked up on while I was listening to a podcast recently. And Esther Choi, who's an architectural historian and a multidisciplinary artist, is one of my favorite people to listen to. Because what she begins to point out is effectively what brings people in to do the kind of work that we do today. And while she talks of architecture, it's interesting to start thinking about the resonances that begin to play up in our world in service design. As we begin to go through these slides, you'll begin to see how we've been thinking about stuff. And Valeria, if you wouldn't mind moving on, I think at Frog, and Frog's been through a moment of transition, and we've come together as IDEAN, Fahrenheit 212, and Frog, really beginning to bring together the team that is now innovation, strategy, and design at Frog. And within service design itself as a practice, we spent a lot of time over the last 3 odd years talking about how we should always bring along academic inquiry, our own personal obsessions, and really understanding what the market demands of us, our practices in the public and the private sector, as much as our introspections around social impact and policy to the table when we come together. It becomes incredibly important for us to bring all of those 5 things in balance together so that we can continue to push the bounds of our practice. We can really begin to push what it is that we can do for the world as we begin to get stronger as practitioners and stronger with things that you'll all recognize, which is our toolkits and our methodologies. Today, I'm here with Valeria Adani to bring to you some of these thoughts. But we begin to bring to you some of the thoughts that are representative of a broader group of people that surround us, who to me are the most awesome service designers in the world. And I'm just incredibly grateful to work with the likes of them, to be able to begin to think about what keeps us going and where we go next.
So as part of the work that Payal and I have been doing with the team in the past 3 years, as part of our transition into our new roles, we started thinking about what keeps us going in service design. And a few weeks back, I'm sure lots of you have seen this picture on LinkedIn and Twitter. And at the moment it popped out into our feed, Payal and I sent it to each other. We all wanted to change the world through service design. But what happened, because we had to, that we commoditized service design to a point that it was useful for us as a community to make sure that it was easier to digest, more accessible, easy to sell, easy to be accepted, easy for us to find and carve our word, our little piece of word in the world of design, when 10, 15 years ago, no one knew about service design. So it was important to make service design more predictable, simpler, to explain the complexity of services. But now that we are here, we think that we need to grow and we need to take responsibility in pushing those boundaries, innovate, and go back to being a bit of, take responsibility and be activists in our own practice without necessarily transfiguring it into another discipline or like stealing from another discipline or adopt yet another toolkit or another framework. But this is the direction of travel. We think we really have the responsibility, especially towards the people that are coming to the practice right now. I'm sure all of us have seen how many new job posts are popping up in service design. We owe it to the people that haven't been around for 15 years like we did, like we're a bit of the old gang. We owe to the new generations to define what's the next for service design. So because we are not busy enough in our world, we set a task to ourselves, Payal and I, to provocate each other as part of our handovers from more practitioners to managers, and Payal moving into like managing a big team. While we're stepping into our new roles, what kind of future do we want to build together? So you've seen a number of provocations here, but unfortunately we only have 20 minutes together. So we selected a few, but we hope that this provocation can be used later on during the Q&A to open the conversation with everyone. So in terms of the first provocation that I absolutely love, and we've speaking about this for a long time, it's all about service design. Its language and tools are commoditized now, and the plain business speak today. So where's next? I wanted to start this first provocation response with a very old picture of me. This is, I think, 2012, 2013. It was the first time I was organizing a global service jam. And back in those days, I used to call myself a service design evangelist. Then now it makes me almost like cry when I think about it. But at that time, as a service design community, we needed and we wanted to evangelize. We wanted to create awareness around our practice. We wanted people to understand what we were doing, and we wanted to create the demand for us to actually have a job. So I don't regret, and I will never regret what I've done in the past 10 years of evangelization. But it's not a bad thing. Commoditization and the fact that service design is very accessible right now, it's important, and we should be proud of what we achieved. But the reality is that we need to respond to new context, new need, new sets of problem, new expectation, and a very mature practice that is struggling right now to actually define what's next on their plate. We need to move away from toolkits. We need to move away from just applying a methodology and look at service design as an attitude, a way of reasoning and logic. What I see today is that we are dealing with the new materiality of service design. We are really moving away from just services and products, and we are starting to deal with new elements to define the future of the practice. We are just not dealing with product and services anymore. That's what I studied 10 years ago plus in Polytechnic. It was product service system design. But our new materiality, the material that we are using in our practice, are organizations and people. So we deal more and more in defining more complex systems, communities, and platforms. We see it in so many places. I just brought up a few examples. Public sector has been dealing with this kind of complexity in a long time. Every day, I mean, once a week now, I'm going to the office, I'm seeing this new service that you see in the video in the middle, that is a collaboration between the Mayor of London, a few councils, and a private company called Buried Bikes about cargo bike sharing. Or the example on the left is a collaboration between Uber and Walgreens about making COVID vaccine, let's say, booking and accessibility much more easier for people that are living far away from pharmacies. And on the right, you see, I would say, the best example of platform design and the future of what services are going to be, that is WeChat. This is just one of the many functions. The one you see on screen is the pay and social gifting example. But platform and services are going to be more and more what we deal with rather than just silos. We're not just breaking silos anymore, but we are breaking organizational barriers. So we're going to have more and more a convergence of touch points and a proliferation of services that deal more and more with complexity. So what it means is that with this new materiality of people and organization, more complexity, service design is dealing with new ranges, new areas, and therefore we need new skill sets. And it's a whole continuum of expansion. And while we were going through this with Payal, we wanted to introduce to the audience today with an idea of how this future of service design could be. And it's a work in progress and it's not done yet. But the idea is that the spectrum and the continuum of service design is actually moving away from just design, and it's encompassing multiple things at the same time. Service design is dealing with strategy and envisioning and questioning the nature of services, the nature of this organization responses. We're dealing more and more with service transformation, so making things better, making services better. We're dealing more and more with service management, and Mark and I have spoken about this a few weeks back, about how service design has to deal more and more with implementation and iteration and continuous improvement. We're dealing more and more with activation and enablement and how to help organizations to work differently. We're dealing more and more with the service experience side of things. That is really about the people involved in delivering a service, either customers or co-workers. And last but not least, we are dealing more and more in wider service ecosystems. So going beyond pure touch points and experiences and looking at relationships. This is how so when we see service design as this big continuum, it becomes really clear that we need new skill set. And some people talk about a full stack service designer, where there is one service designer that can do it all. My argument is that we need a diversification of skills and a diversification of professions within the service design realm that covers all these different aspects of the delivery and design of services. So the second provocation was all around shrinking or expanding, like does service design need to shrink or expand? And I truly believe it's all about expansion, not just become more insular and more closed and inaccessible. But we really need to move away from just redesigning mere services and product, while we are looking at redesigning communities and ecosystems and orchestrate at scale. We can't do this alone. We have to do it with data scientists like Lassie, economists, storytellers, but also people that have been doing this for a long time, like product managers and the service managers. So we need to break that problem-solving narrative where we keep saying like we are designers and service designers are great problem solvers. We're actually great problem framers. We are better. We need to get better at problem solving. And we need to move away from just fixing services and going upstreams and downstreams. And what do I mean with this? Going upstreams mean really helping organizations leading the change, challenge the current models, challenge, not just fix and improve whatever service or just design a new app. How many times did we hear, I need an app? But we really need to help our clients and organizations in linking business and strategy and redefine the value and the meaning of services that they deliver. So going upstreams. But on the other side, we also need to go downstreams. We keep saying that service design is never finished. But oh my God, as a community, we are not really great at implementation, aren't we? So implement, maintain, continuously improve services, create the right environment for those services to be implemented. And taking into consideration that since we are challenging current models, we can expect a certain level of resistance. So how can we help organizations go beyond that resistance? So while we are expanding and while we are moving upstream and downstreams, I really think we need to move away from the traditional view of just service design as experience design, looking at the individuals, and start looking at the collectives delivering those services, co-workers, team members, going one level up and looking at organizations, capabilities, infrastructures, but also the intent of this organization and the reason of being. And last but not least, we need to look at the wider society, its values, its models, and its structures. And to do this, we need to make sure that we have new skill sets and and a number of new professions within service design. And naturally then, I'm gonna hand over to Payal. Is service design the right term to define what we do anymore, or is it obsolete?
These are interesting provocations that were set for me by Valeria. And I think what is very evident to me was that I needed to go back again to practices I deeply admire to really begin to think about what have I learned, having worked across multidisciplinary teams, but also having worked across practices. As we begin to think about visuals like this, I used to work in the built environment practice once upon a time. And what is incredibly evident to me is the reason why I think I shifted away from it is because it had all become more of the same. I had always thought of architecture as a discipline that would allow me to really go as close as it gets to understanding what people need, how people live, how people behave, what mindsets allow them to consume what they consume, and the choices that they make for themselves and their families. However, architecture had become incredibly flat. It had become incredibly the stronghold of the aesthetic, to really, where people had begun to think that everyone lives the same way, and if they don't, they aspire to. And every Pinterest board looked the same. Every mood board looked the same. Instagram looks the same. It looks the same because there is a sense of there is only one way to solve a problem, whereas the lives that we live are way more complex than we can even begin to imagine. I think what I struggle with is that service design may go the same way. It may go the same way with an obsession with methodologies and toolkits. It may go the same way when we begin to fall in love with a hammer, especially when the people who come to work with us, the people who would want us to change the world for the better, expect us to give them something to sit on, and all we can produce for them is a tool, not effectively something for them to sit on. And it's an analogy I use pretty often, which is to really try and understand what people need. We really need to drill down to what is that chaos that makes it harder for them to solve their problems on their own. And it therefore brings people like ourselves into the mix. Naively, therefore, about 8 or 9 years ago, I started trying to articulate what service design really was, because of course, I was a part of a community where every time that question was asked of a service designer, someone or the other went into absolute exhilaration, or someone or the other went to live under a rock, because it was hard to define. To me, it was the craft that helped define the organization's response to what a customer needs. And the more I've thought about it, the more I've stepped away from my role as the head of service design at Frog now. I realize that this definition needs to go into the bin. It needs to go into the bin, particularly because it served its purpose. It's done what it needed to do for us to understand where we needed to go. But the truth is, every organization wants to create some response to what a customer needs, because at the end of the day, most organizations have now woken up to the need for understanding customer centricity. Our times are more complex now, and I think this is where beginning to really think about a new business model innovation, really beginning to think about societal impact, really beginning to think about public policy, begins to become really important to begin to stretch the world that we live in. But also what you begin to see is an image next to this definition, which had become my image to reflect on every time I thought about what I did, because this was an image of a 6-hour-long workshop that Lily, who I used to work with, ran to try and untangle, I guess, what could only be defined as the best problem I've ever solved. And 6 hours later, I felt like I had actually tried to solve this problem. And this image with lots of post-its was a good recollection of time well spent on a problem worth solving. Last evening, when we were talking about the sorts of slides we bring to the mix, I looked up on a stock image library some images of post-its. So I effectively just looked up post-its. And then I looked up the word corporate. The truth is, there are lots of happy people in these images. I have no idea who they are. And if any one of you happens to feature in this image, I'm really sorry. You happen to be on a stock photo library. The truth is, when we see these things from afar, they're just post-its. When we see these things from afar, they're just a bunch of happy people working together. But we need to go beyond this as the image of what service design does, because otherwise we're doing ourselves a huge disservice for the kinds of problems we actually solve and the kind of impact that we actually have on the world. And I think the reason why we can't evolve is because we've fallen in love with our own image. We've fallen in love with the idea of this flatness that has allowed us to become accessible and understood by the world around us. And economists talk about this often around what it means to constantly question your practice. And I think there's so much to learn from all of these variances around us to really begin to think about where we go next. As we move on, Valeria, if you wouldn't mind, I think Valeria has introduced to you the service design continuum we've been working on. And if you have this on your screen, so go ahead and take some screenshots, because we'd love to have a conversation with you all about this. We really want to start thinking about what are the modes that people operate in. This is not to say that if you work in service transformation, you cannot work in service experience, but there is a great chance that what you enjoy more is service transformation than service enablement. And I think these may be modes that service designers in the future begin to operate in. These may become phases of projects. These may become different capabilities we look to learn more about or box ourselves into. And I think the choice will be one that every individual makes for themselves. But I think the umbrella of service design is potentially, it needs that stretch, because I think service design by itself does a lot of disservice to effectively the world of things that service designers could do. And at the end of the day, it is about those echoes and resonances. It is about really beginning to think about where are we deriving from, who are we working with, what are the things we're facilitating, and what are the things that we genuinely need to bring together in order to think about the change that we set out to bring in the world. But of course, I also reflect on all the things I've said before. I've often talked about service design as the glue. The truth is, it's a sticky matter. Being the glue makes you rather invisible. And if service design only became the discipline on the edge of everything else, we would have potentially done ourselves a massive disservice for effectively everything we could have done together. And so there is a need to begin to create those bounds, to expand those bounds, and really begin to think about where next. Because at the end of the day, flattening that practice is not going to help us. Really beginning to explore the intersectionality and the interdimensionality of that practice is what is going to effectively move us forward. And if we talked about we shouldn't have another framework. We also talked about how service design is in design thinking. We see the irony in this. We see it out loud and clear. Valeria and I and all of the group within Frog who practice service design are not suggesting there's only one way to shape this framework. What we are suggesting is that there is a need to broaden the idea of the practice. And this could look like anything. But of course, it always helps for it to look like something familiar. Let's just stop being lazy. Let's just start having these conversations. Let's find these forums to talk about where next. Because at the end of the day, where we end up and the kinds of problems we look to solve will be the ones that are way closer in the mirror than we can even imagine. The problems that we need to solve for are effectively the sorts of problems we can solve as we evolve. If we don't evolve and if we only think that journeys and blueprints are going to solve those problems for us, we would have missed a trick. You know, at the end of the day, this evolution is effectively going to bring us the change that we think we deserve and we think the world deserves. As we begin to think about where next, as we begin to think about why next, I think we have to just stop and think about each one of our worlds and think about the signs that we are seeing. Think about the demands in the market changing, think about in-house and agency teams, and really beginning to think about how we begin to practice in the public and the private sector. Think about the problems we will now solve. And I think the problems we will now solve are not the ones we have been wanting to solve. They're not just the ones across these spectrums. They are the ones that we may have created ourselves. And in trying to solve those problems for the future, we may end up solving the problems that no one else is going to look at. So it's an open invitation to all of you to poke every hole you can in this new framework that we'd like to introduce to you, and really begin to think about those bounds of the individual collectives, organizations, and society, and really begin to think about how across each one of those layers, we could be practitioners in service transformation, service management, service enablement, service experience, service ecosystems, and service strategy as effectively new ways of moving forward. So we don't just end up being service designers forever after. Thank you.
Thank you, Payal and Valeria. I see a lot of questions coming in the chat. We'll have a short Q&A after our next presentation. Thank you once again, and I hope many people will reach out to you on LinkedIn and other media to poke holes in the framework. And Valeria, our conversation will be online coming Tuesday, by the way, on the
super soon
on the Service Design Show.
Thanks so much, Mark. We'll see you at the Q&A in a few minutes.